Once live. Welcome, Secretary Moore. Thanks for joining us to get an update on school construction and PCBs. It's an issue that the committee has been watching closely from the revenue side, as anything that happens on this affects the Ed Fund. And so we're sort of following the issue with bated breath.
Yes.
So excited that you're here to talk to us. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me in. For the record, Julie Moore, and I'm the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources. And this presentation largely focuses on the technical aspects of the work that we are undertaking currently, looking at or looking for indoor air contamination from PCBs and building materials in schools. At the end, we'll sort of bring it together with the Agency of Education, who obviously has an important role to play in this space too, not the least of which is that the funding you alluded to is in the Ed Fund. So just to level set and make sure everyone has a sense of what actually are PCBs. These are polychlorinated biphenyls. They were manufactured in the US between 1930 and 1979 when production was banned by the US Environmental Protection Agency. The Monsanto Corporation was the sole producer of PCBs in the United States, and the best estimate is there's about 1.5 billion pounds of these chemicals that were produced in the United States during that roughly 40 or 50-year period. One thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about concentrations of PCBs that are problematic, we're talking about parts per billion. So the idea that there's 1.5 billion pounds of this material around means that there is an inordinate opportunity for contamination. PCBs were banned by EPA because they are persistent, meaning they don't break down quickly, because they are bioaccumulative, meaning that they travel up the food chain. So things that eat other things can have higher concentrations of PCBs. And we know that they are now hazardous at very low levels. And in fact, are one of the few contaminants that EPA has identified as a known carcinogen. So why are we testing for PCBs in Vermont schools? PCBs were devilishly useful. They're used in hundreds of different industrial and commercial applications.
You have someone joining you behind that you can't see.
Excellent. Welcome, Secretary French. Hundreds of different products: caulking, paint, fluorescent light ballasts, window glazing, ceiling tiles, spray-on fireproofing, floor finishes, glues, carbonless copy paper. They're everywhere. And more recently, PCBs were found at very high levels in Burlington High School as they were doing some routine testing as part of a planned renovation project. This raised concerns that similar conditions could exist in other school buildings. And Act 74 was passed by the legislature in 2021 that requires indoor air testing in all schools in Vermont that were either constructed or renovated before 1980. And currently the requirement is to complete that work by July 1st, 2025. DEC has hired a team of 6 different consulting firms that we are making available to schools to perform this testing consistent with some standard operating procedures that DEC has put together. So in terms of our approach to this testing, we're following the process we follow for any contaminated site. We sometimes refer to this as our I rule, but it starts with sampling. Then we look at if there's immediate mitigation measures that need to be deployed, which are cleanup strategies that can be used in short order that may or may not permanently address the problem. And then following that, we look at remediation. DEC has an active role in each step of that process and helps ensure that everybody follows what we believe to be best practice. The testing we're conducting at schools is representative. That means we are not testing every room, but rather we are grouping rooms that were built or renovated at a similar point in time and so have similar building materials. And we are then comparing the results of those sampling efforts with screening levels and action levels that were determined by the Department of Health. Screening level is intended to acknowledge PCBs are everywhere, as I said before, and there's some background level that's essentially unavoidable in modern society. The action levels tell us when steps need to be taken to reduce exposure, that it's simply too high. We all are working to keep PCB levels in indoor air in schools as low as possible. If a school action level is exceeded, it generally means we're looking for the school to take steps within the next 12 months to bring down those concentrations. If an immediate action level is exceeded, emergency corrective actions need to be taken. And that can include things like eliminating use of the room or limiting the amount of time students may spend in a particular space, as well as deploying mitigation measures to reduce PCB concentrations. And that's things like cleaning the HVAC system and tuning it up so it's performing at its maximum, or looking for other ways that can quickly reduce PCB concentrations. So the testing began in June of last year. We know there are at least 325 schools that meet the standard that we laid out, which is having been built or significantly renovated prior to 1980. There are about another 40 schools that may ultimately require testing. So the universe is somewhere between 325 and 366. To date, we've completed testing on 19 schools, and 5 of these exceeded one of those 2 action levels. I've listed the schools there, and we are actively working with each of them to develop a specific response plan. We've also...
One second.
Just curious, how in those cases are accommodations able to keep students in most of those buildings, or are the challenges so it's really folks often have to relocate, and is there support for communities to like navigate all the challenges that come along with that?
Yes.
Action.
So maybe starting with the last piece, which is DEC, the health department and the education agency have worked closely together to develop a set of communication materials that schools can use in sharing information with their community, both before we initiate testing, once results are received, and if action levels dictate that there are necessary next steps in the schools. So we've helped provide, I think, some pretty good structure or bones that schools can use in having those conversations with their communities. To date, of those 4 schools that have experienced contamination, only one of them has been in a true instructional space. Many of you may have read about Cabot School in the news. It was limited to the gymnasium. It wasn't actually in any of the classrooms, and so they've made alternative arrangements for having kids have gym and also lunch. In Oak Grove, there were concentrations in a classroom that exceeded the school action level, so it didn't require the room to be immediately vacated. But my understanding is they may have relocated those instructional activities. We have not seen instances of widespread sort of whole school level contamination in the testing done to date, so it hasn't created that kind of urgent situation.
And it's great to hear that there's communication support, because obviously getting the message right.
Correct.
All the things. What about from like a human capacity and or like a financial resource support, finding alternative locations if needed, and sometimes associated costs might be really difficult for a small community to manage.
So we'll get to that in just a minute, as talking about we have some funding available for mitigation support, and relocation is one of the mitigation options, but it's the option of last resort.
I see a lot of questions, so happy to do Representative Anthony, Representative Maslin, but also want to make sure that we get through the presentation. You're not sort of...
Sure, I only have a couple more slides. I don't know if it's helpful to...
Oh, wait.
Okay. So we've completed 19 schools. We have 9 other schools where the tests have been collected. One of the things we've learned is that lab capacity is a significant constraint in our ability to do these tests and have them turn around in a timely manner. There are only 3 labs that are available to us in this part of the country that are able to analyze the collectors that we are setting out. We have been working with the Vail Lab, which is the state-owned lab at Vermont Tech, the Vermont Ag and Environment Lab, and they are in the process of standing up capacity that will be very helpful to us and hopefully expedite priority samples. And then we have 35 additional schools where we've paired them up with a consultant, and they are working with that consultant to do the evaluation of their building and identifying group-like rooms so that a sampling program can be designed. In terms of the funding that's available, Act 74 provided $4.5 million to DEC to complete this indoor air testing. We know that this money will be sufficient to cover our operations through the coming this current fiscal year, as well as the coming fiscal year. But this has been somewhat more resource intensive than we initially anticipated, particularly that pre-work of grouping like rooms takes more time and effort than we had initially projected, and so may need to come back for additional funding in FY25 to complete the mandated testing. The next piece, I'm trying to think what the best way to transition this. Just going to talk a little bit about what happens after contamination is found. So as I noted, mitigation measures are those immediate and often interim steps, not permanent solutions, but it's things like working on the air handling system to increase the throughput, which in turn reduces PCB levels in indoor air. Generally, we ask for schools to do mitigation in conjunction with additional investigation. And this is where they go and test materials. So the indoor air sample is, I would call it a composite sample. It can't tell you what exactly in the room is contributing to the contamination, just that there's contamination in the room. So the next step is to actually start to test building materials. And we're doing that on a project by project basis, but we also have entered into a contract with the University of Iowa, who is helping us better understand what materials are most likely to be problematic. And there are different types of PCB compounds, and based on that sort of compound fingerprint, Iowa is helping us try to figure out if we can how quickly we can narrow in on the potential PCB source in a particular setting. But as we sit here today, the sources are often not immediately evident and do require additional testing. We know that access to funding is essential oftentimes, particularly for our smaller schools, to be able to quickly respond to these exceedances. If they don't have a cash reserve, they may not be able to move as quickly as we would like. And the additional testing generally, we anticipate will cost between $30,000 and $75,000 per school. In October of last year, Secretary French and I went to the emergency board and received authorization to use up to $2.5 million of the funding that's in the Ed Fund for PCB mitigation and remediation to fund that materials testing and use of mitigation measures. Somewhat to our surprise, no mitigation funds have been spent at this point, although we do have the 5 schools that have identified PCBs. Remediation is that permanent step to identify and then eliminate sources of PCBs. And this often involves either isolating or encapsulating. There are special paints that can be used to prevent PCBs from off-gassing into rooms, or removing those building materials that are contaminated entirely. There was in Act 178 of 2022, there was this $32 million reserve created within the education fund for this work. The $2.5 million the e-board authorized last year is part of that 32. So we do have the balance of $29.5 million. And the agency submitted a report, I believe, earlier today, with our recommended approach for how to deploy that $32 million to schools as needs arise. And it's a cost share approach. It's an 80-20 cost share approach, with the state covering 80% of the cost to implement the remediation plan and schools required to fund the remaining 20%.
You're describing the recommendation in the report you submitted today?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. And the cost share, we identified caps in the cost share, recognizing that the resources currently available are finite. These cost shares are consistent with our brownfields program, which is how we arrived at them. So $200,000 for assessment, $500,000 for mitigation, and $2 million for remediation per building. The intention would be for AOE to administer grants through its existing grant management system, drawing on the known relation or the established relationships they have with Vermont schools. but the payment would be made on a reimbursement basis after DEC approved the work. Again, tying it back to our I rule and how we handle all contaminated sites. In terms of next steps, we are certainly at this point moving at a clip of about 30 to 40 schools a quarter, and we'll need to sustain that pace through June 30th of 2025 in order to meet the current deadline for having all schools sampled. That is going to be challenging for us, and we can probably talk about that more a bit later. As I noted earlier, we are working to bring online sampling analysis capacity at the Vail Lab in Randolph. We expect that they'll have capacity to test about 30 samples a week, which would work out to be about 1 to 2 schools a week. And we're testing on average 3 to 4 schools a week. So it doesn't fully meet our needs, but it does provide some much needed capacity, particularly if we're looking at mitigation measures and have deployed something in a room and want to make sure it's had the intended effect. And then we have been working hand in glove with all the 5 schools I've noted that have had results above the action levels to drive a corrective action plan. And AOE, and I'm happy to turn the floor over to Secretary French, has been working on some expanded communication support, I think very much in line, Representative Sims, with the question you asked, and maybe turn it over to Dan if you want to add in there.
And Secretary French, I know you only have, I think, 5 minutes left that you can be here with us. And so would ask you within that 5 minutes to speak to how this lines up with the school construction study and making sure that we're continuing to keep those conversations completely aligned as we look at funding options.
Yeah, thank you for the prompt, Dan French, Secretary of Education. Yes, to Representative Sims' question, we started to notice as the pattern of testing emerged that the Agency of Education could be doing more around the communications support to districts and the planning support. Secretary Moore mentioned we did, in cooperation with Agency of Natural Resources, create a fairly extensive toolkit for communications with the Vermont Department of Health's involvement as well. But we noticed the districts needed more help with planning. So ultimately, we formed an advisory group with a group of superintendents. Cabot superintendent in particular has been exceedingly helpful in that work. And the result of that, very similar to our pattern of support in the COVID-19 pandemic, was to produce operational guidance, basically some planning documents on how to assist school officials with the planning, with, just Representative Sims' point, the primary goal of ensuring continuity of in-person instruction, particularly coming out of the pandemic last year. In addition to that, and that was accomplished prior to the winter holiday period, so we published our joint operations guidance to school districts, but we also followed up simultaneously what we call pre-game planning sessions. So we invited districts that were going to be going through the testing in the near future to participate in planning sessions to walk through that operational guidance so they can start evaluating other facilities they might use in the worst case scenario and so forth, but essentially just to become more familiar with the testing protocols and the steps in the process. To the question about school construction, we have a fairly solid policy framework for school construction under Act 72. The challenge for us, and it's sort of in the background here, the agency does have some additional, I would say, project management oversight of this work, very similar to our school construction responsibilities. I think most folks are aware we've had a moratorium on school construction aid since 2007. Act 72 starts us down that path of resurrecting that program. And we have some discrete tasks we're trying to accomplish under Act 72 to leverage our limited amount of time with federal relief dollars. Namely, we're completing, and we're contracting this out to the greatest extent possible. We're completing an inventory of school facilities that was done last spring. We're now about to complete a more detailed facilities assessment. We also have assignments to update our school construction standards and to work on identifying sources of funding for school construction. All of that work takes additional capacity. In addition to doing this work, the General Assembly did assign us an additional position. We've been having difficulty filling that position. We have an internal position we'll also assign to that team. So hopefully in the near future, we'll have a team of 2 individuals dedicated to all the work related to what we call safe and healthy schools. But I expect that team will need to be expanded over time. It could be achieved to a certain extent by transferring resources from one part of the agency to another. But I think I would think that we're going to have growing capacity in this area to supervise some of these projects and important work with districts in the near future. We have been out of this business, as I mentioned, since the moratorium in 2007. At that time, the agency had 3 full-time FTEs just to administer the construction program. So it is an area of growing importance. We've been, to their credit, making a lot of progress with school districts, with the federal relief funding that we have available. But we very much try to consider the PCB work in that context so we can manage all of the work that's involved with school facilities.
So Secretary French, when the deeper inventory is completed later this month?
No, it won't be completed to the fall. We received
Okay.
an extension from the General Assembly. That's called the assessment.
Okay, thank you. When the assessment is completed in the fall, will it be inclusive of the PCB remediation needs, or are those going to, yeah.
That's a separate issue. And again, that the PCB project was passed into law much after the time when the assessment was put into motion. So we'll have to reconcile that. I don't think that'll be difficult per se, but the assessment will provide us a far more detailed understanding of facilities needs across the state. The issues of PCBs, I think, will still be ongoing at that time, but it'll be interesting to line up that work to get a better view of what the needs are of our school districts.
Do you have a sense of when they'd be lined up? I just know that remediation for PCBs could be school construction, and school construction could be remediation for PCBs. So I just trying to understand when we'll have and I know having a full picture of anything in Vermont is impossible, but
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have a sense of when we'll have a fuller picture of how those two needs overlap,
Yeah, I don't,
given staff.
I think a good intersection point perhaps is indoor air quality. But again, we're gaining more experience with this process as we go along, and that the result of that experience was forming this advisory group and so forth. But the PCB testing and remediation is a much longer term process. Secretary Moore has identified several different courses of action the districts can take as part of that. So it's a lot harder for me to describe it. I mean, if I compare it to lead in drinking water, for example, where we know how to remediate for lead, you remove a faucet and so forth, and you can check the box and say it's complete. PCB remediation is far more complex, and it's a longer term process. I think certainly identifying issues of safety are a priority and will be assessed as part of the assessment process. But to what extent the intersection between that and the remediation needs emerges is unclear to me at this point. I suspect, again, indoor air quality will be a major strategy in the PCB mitigation and in the assessment as well. So that could be the place where we could make progress, where we are making progress, and probably should be a focus of future efforts.
And I'm sorry if I'm putting too fine a point on this. I think my overarching concern is, one, just getting a sum total of how much money we're talking about.
Right.
But two, are there schools that we're going to be investing a lot of money in, say, PCB remediation, that 6 months later we're going to find out that they have, say, septic needs that would really be more efficiently met by tearing down the entire building?
Right.
And so that's why I keep on asking the same question over and over again.
Right. I think we'll see the assessment results before the final PCB conclusions are available. So I think that's the good news with that. Again, I think it was a prudent course of action for us to start doing that inventory and start doing an assessment. So we'll have that information and that data available, I think, prior to a lot of the PCB conclusions becoming more manifest.
And so next January, we would have a complete picture of these two issues?
Yes, I think, well, I think certainly on the assessment, I'm not sure, again, on the course with the PCBs will take several years, but we'll know some schools certainly, but the assessment should be totally complete by January of next year.
I think I failed to mention in my overview that we have prioritized the school based on risk factors. Mm-hmm. So I did mention that.
Oh, maybe we're in a previous presentation. Sorry.
So including age of students, but also the construction timeline. So our hope would be that the schools we're testing currently are the ones at greatest risk of PCB contamination. That said, we don't know what we don't know. So, and our work, as Secretary French alluded to, does stretch considerably longer than his, with right now looking at a July 1st, 2025 completion date. So still 2.5 years to get through all the schools.
Thank you. Representative Anthony and Representative Meslin, if you still have something now that I've asked you to ask. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, given the ubiquity of the materials that include polyvinyl biphenyls, you have isolated, at least primarily, air as a real suspect vector. And then the question is, are there other vectors that you can either dismiss or eliminate, or are there yet others, given, again, the range of materials that will not be cured by air handling?
Yes.
Yes, and yes, but I just want to be sure, following the worry that some things will not be cured, and then we're into tearing down, replumbing, whatever it is. And good to know that, so we don't repeat, if you will, activities.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note air handling and improvements to the air handling system are generally considered a mitigation measure. They're not actually curing the problem. The source would continue to exist. Up until we initiated this testing, most of the information we had about PCBs and building materials was schools would do routine materials testing as they were considering a renovation project in order to figure out what proper disposal of their construction waste looked like. There's similar testing that is undertaken for lead paint and also asbestos-containing materials as schools are planning renovation projects. And that's really how the contamination at Burlington came to light. And as a result of some very high materials concentrations, we went back and tested indoor air. We flipped that around for this testing program and are testing indoor air first. And then where we identify a problem, looking at the building materials to see what may be the actual source. But you're right, at this point, we don't have great information on sources. I think we've seen it from being in paint, in light ballasts, in window caulk and window glazing. And then ultimately all of those things turn into dust and it ends up in the HVAC system as well.
And the education committee is going to spend a lot more time on this aspect of the conversation than we are. Just want to reassure everyone that we don't have to fully understand this issue. Representative Odie, Representative Sim.
Just want to add that I'm sure as part of when the planning happens that to add in the cost to do testing annually if you don't take a building down.
So our recommendation has been, and I would need to get back to you to confirm this, but if you're within, I think it's if you're within 75% of the action level. So even if you were below the school action level, but 75% of that number, we do recommend periodic retesting. This is not envisioned to be an annual testing program other than in instances where there's some amount of PCBs present that exceeds our screening level, that background level, but doesn't rise to the action level at the moment we're in the building.
This might be for Secretary French. Just following up on my earlier conversation, again, really great to hear about the communication support for schools and maybe the additional planning support and the need for more capacity at AOE. I'm curious whether we're asking or whether we're hearing from communities and schools about what human capacity they might need on the ground to kind of go through all of this, especially if mitigation and remediation is on the docket. In part I ask because, followed along as my community has dealt with PFAS in the municipal water system, and our municipal water board with volunteers has been really grateful for all the support from DEC to help navigate that. But it has been a significant challenge for that volunteer board to come up to speed on all of the PFAS things. And I think we're on our 5th or 6th well drilling, and navigating all the funding sources has been a huge lift. And so I want to make sure that as we're thinking about what statewide capacity we need, whether we're asking and hearing from schools what they need to be able to handle what might be coming down the pike for them.
Yeah, we haven't yet per se, but it is a concern that has been a topic of conversation among our advisory group. We've seen as a result of Act 46 in particular, a centralization of facilities management across the state, meaning that districts who merged, one of the artifacts, if you will, of that activity is that they tend to create a central facilities management position, which gives them additional capacity and increased professionalization of an understanding of the condition of their facilities. But we also know across the state that the capacity of our central office varies considerably. So we have central offices that are really struggling at any given moment to maintain capacity. I can think of 2 central offices that have entirely new teams this year. So it will be a concern, and it's one where we have on our radar, but it hasn't. We've been lucky, I guess, so far in terms of the testing results that we haven't really seen that happen where the district on the other end of the phone, so to speak, didn't have the capacity to begin to address the issues. But I think also to their credit, there's been a lot of direct outreach from the other state agencies, A&R, Department of Health. I think Secretary Moore used the phrase hand in glove. That's been very true. But that remains a concern over time as the number of schools being tested continues to increase and grow. And it'll be challenging for us to manage this complex activity, both at the state and the local level.
Representative Odie and then Secretary French, I want to make sure you have a chance to exit gracefully when you're at that point.
Thank you.
My question is about funding remediation and the cost share cap. So is that for you? Okay, so if you have 20 classrooms, it's the same as if you have 10 classrooms? Is that what it looks like?
That, correct. The proposal is on a per school building basis.
So why wasn't the number of pupils in the building considered or the size of the building considered?
We talked about a number of different possible approaches for trying to equitably distribute the funding. And it's incredibly challenging and look forward to this body's input. At the end of the day, we felt like staying consistent with our existing brownfields program made a lot of sense in that those numbers tend to reflect costs we typically see on a site that doesn't sort of raise itself to a separate remediation program we operate called BRELA, where for more complex sites. But there's certainly other approaches.
Will you be able to see those other approaches at some point?
I'm not sure. I mean, I know we've discussed them. I'm not sure I have them written out in any particular fashion, but we can certainly bring back information on the other approaches that were considered.
That'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Anything else either of you want to share with us? Thank you. Really appreciate the update on your process and all the work that you've done on this. I know that Oak Grove School is appreciative of the opportunity. Any other questions from anyone? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Treasurer Pichek, I believe you are next up. Welcome to the Ways and Means Committee.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, I will maybe first make introductions of the folks on my team that are here since we haven't been in front of House Ways and Means yet this session. So from left to right, Scott Baker is our Director of Financial Reporting. So Scott's been with the Treasurer's Office over a decade and with Vermont Housing Finance Authority for a couple of decades prior to coming to the Treasurer's Office. So a lot of experience in debt management and financial reporting, and fortunate to have him here with us today, but generally at the Treasurer's Office as well. And then Ashlyn is our Director of Policy, Special Projects, and Financial Literacy. So specifically as it relates to policy in the legislature, she's our point person on all legislative initiatives and testimony requests and things like that. So Ashlyn's a good point of contact if you're ever trying to get a hold of the Treasurer's Office and need expertise from our agency. And then Nick Marino is my executive assistant, so he does everything relating to me and where I need to be and what I need to be doing. So if you ever need to get a hold of me, Nick's a good point of contact in terms of that. So really fortunate to have them here.
Thank you. And Secretary Moore, I'm sorry, I realized that we didn't introduce ourselves to you when you got here. I lose track of who's been here before anyway. For both of you and your team, let's do a little round of introductions. I'm Emily Kornheiser.
Bill Canfield.
Julia Andrews.
Kathleen Sims.
Chris Mattos.
Kurt Taylor.
Peter Anthony Barry.
And Carolyn Brannigan.
Carolyn.
Carl Demerol.
I'm not Saoirse, but I think everyone always knows her first. So I think you're going to come back in at a later point to talk about the treasurer's office more broadly. And so thanks for bearing with this
Yeah, for sure.
dive before we get to the broad picture. I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. So we do have a presentation that we provided that has a little bit of an overview on the general debt management of the state and of our office, and talks about how we do that process now, and a little bit about prior to the moratorium when bonding was issued, by the state, that was a component of school construction. And then have a couple of slides outlining the process that the state of Rhode Island took in tackling this problem. There's a lot of similarities between where their state was a number of years ago and where our state is at the current moment that I think might be useful and illustrative for the committee as you think about your work. But just generally on slide 3, the bonding that the state of Vermont conducts, just to think about this as the same concept as a home mortgage. So it is a loan for a significant purchase, a large purchase. And let's say in this case, a state office building, it's something that will last for decades, that will be around for the long term, but you don't necessarily want to spend all the money up front, or you don't necessarily have all the money up front to spend to build the building. But you want to get the immediate benefits of that building, and bonding is a significant way to do that. Just like a home mortgage, Vermont bonds have a fixed interest rate that will be paid over the life of the bond. Our bonds are typically 20 years statutorily. So unlike a residential mortgage, it might be 30 years. The Vermont bonds are 20-year bonds in duration. Payments are made every 6 months on interest, every 12 months on principal. So differentiating between a mortgage there where you pay principal and interest every month. Our payments on Vermont bonds are level payments. So the payments are larger than later payments, and the amount borrowed is repaid sooner. So unlike your mortgage where you see all that money going to interest early on and then principal gets paid off later, sort of that's happening at that principal payoff is happening at a much faster rate on our Vermont bonds. And generally we can only refinance these every 10 years. These are requirements that purchasers will expect to see or negotiate into the bonds so that they know they'll get a certain interest rate for a fixed period of time in case the market moves against them over the course of 5 or 10 years. We guarantee payment of these funds out of the general fund. So it's not like your home where it's your house that would be taken by the bank. The general fund is at risk here. And obviously we have a lot of bond purchasers when we issue a bond, investment banks, retail investors, Vermonters, versus working with a single financial institution or credit union. So the Treasurer's Office manages this process. We are responsible for managing all the state's debt and bonds, managing the issuance, the ongoing administration, paying of principal and of interest, monitoring bonds for refinancing opportunities, managing our state's bond rating with the credit rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, Fitch, and the ongoing relationship with those rating agencies, contracting for all debt-related services for Vermont, investment bankers, lawyers, financial advisors, economists, and the like, making sure that we're in compliance with state and federal law, and then also serves as the chair of the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, or CDAC, which we'll mention here in a minute. So just generally over the last couple of decades, Vermont has, well, really for quite a period of time beyond that, we've conscientiously and consistently focused on our bond rating to maintain an excellent bond rating. We are the highest bond rating in New England. That translates into having some of the lowest borrowing costs in New England. The higher your interest, the higher your bond rating, the lower your interest rate. And Vermont has substantially reduced its overall debt burden since the 1990s. So this is something that has been intentional over the past few decades. And there's a note here that to continue with national trends, Vermont would need to continue in that direction, that other states are issuing less debt generally, either going to a pay-go system, which we'll talk about, or other ways of financing. So our debt profile in Vermont is pretty straightforward. It's almost entirely general obligation debt. And I think that's probably all I'll mention there on that slide. Going to the Capital Debt Advisory Committee, Affordability Advisory Committee, this was something that was created decades ago in 1989. It used to be every year there was a recommendation. Now it's every biennium. And it's been unbroken since 1989 that the governor and the legislature have accepted the CDAC recommendation. The credit rating agencies view this as a good process to have this committee that's made up of the treasurer, a treasurer's appointee, somebody from the municipal bond bank, the secretary of administration, and then 2 other governor appointees, so 6 members that vote, plus the auditor and somebody from joint fiscal office as well as non-voting members that come up with a number that Vermont can support in terms of a new issuance of debt. Some of the benchmarks that are looked at are the overall debt as a percentage of our personal income in Vermont, debt service as a percentage of our overall revenues in Vermont, and then the amount of debt issued per capita. And generally in the past 20 years, we've been on the higher end in terms of a higher ranking, which is a good thing actually, away from the median. More recently, we've been closer to the median. And that's why the CDAC report, referenced a lower threshold this year, among other factors.
Good.
My understanding is that the CDAC looks at the things that you've enumerated, but does not look at what the legislature is doing. In other words, if we see, well, we've got school construction coming,
Right.
We've got a new prison, all these things, you don't care about any of that. Or they don't care about any of that. It's strictly the things that you've mentioned here.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair point. Yeah.
Okay.
They're looking at not so much what the wants or needs are, but sort of trying to look at the capacity generally and then leave it to the legislature to fit that capacity and the wants and the needs together.
My way of simplifying it to myself was that when you're going to buy a house, you talk to a realtor says, this is what you can afford, after they ask you some basic questions. But that doesn't, and the attitude from what I understand is that we've been pretty much sticking with what the recommendation is. But as with a realtor, that's not necessarily the best way to go. The realtor may say, you can afford this, but when you're looking at your own personal finances, you say, well, yeah, I can afford it, but I would rather spend it on this, or this is a better investment than that one. So I assume that works with this also, that the recommendation is just a recommendation, not.
Yeah, that's correct. It is solely advisory. I mean, it's advisory to the governor and to the legislature, since 1989, the governor has incorporated the CDAC recommendation into the capital bill and the legislature has followed it. So there's been really consistent, through line there in terms of the recommendation and its implementation, but it is just a recommendation.
Okay, good, thanks.
So I think we covered that part about it being a recommendation. That was on the slides. That's good. So just going into the CDAC report for the current year, more limited debt issuances by other states, including the peer states that are AAA rated, has moved us, as I mentioned, sort of from a stronger median position to right in the median relative to these other states. There's a number of other factors that CDAC thought about this year, like economic uncertainty and volatility, the ability to spend federal funds instead of bonding, the high interest rate environment, the lack of workers and supply chain issues, overall cost of inflation and cost of pricing. So all of those things went into this recommendation for this year's biennium of $108 million, $54 million for each year, represents a 12% reduction from last biennium. And as we mentioned, an overall downward trend, 37% since the 2014-2015 recommendation. And on the next slide, you'll see that those recommendations over time. And you can also sort of point out when 2017 or 2007 is when the school construction moratorium went into place. There was some increased bonding after Irene. There may have been some legacy school construction projects as well. But since that time, the CDAC recommendation and the overall outstanding debt has come down and is following a longer term trend of coming down in Vermont. So one slide here just on school construction, and happy to, if you have any questions, Scott may be able to assist us as well. But you can see here from the bond bank, a slide that they used recently that showed the amount of bonds that they have issued by year, and then the state construction aid highlighted in blue to show you, the percentage of overall bonding that went to school construction aid. So this is at the local level, the aid that they do. And then the authorized but unissued debt more recently that we're still dealing with at the state level as well, because it's not necessarily the appropriate time to go out and bond when we have so much cash in hand. But this 2007, the state put a moratorium on state aid for school building construction. Committed projects that were in the pipeline at that year. It took an additional 5 years to pay off. Estimated need, this is an old number, 500 to 600 million. This is from testimony in 2020. And this is prior to PCB testing. Just to give you another sense, the state of Rhode Island went through this process with all 306 of their schools and came up with a needs assessment of like $2.2 billion. And that was in 2017. So, the price tag will not be small, certainly. And then you see here, most schools utilize the Vermont Municipal Bond Bank for long-term capital, with the exception of a few municipalities that have their own credit rating and go out directly to the bond markets like Burlington. So the thing I wanted to mention, the Rhode Island case study here on slide 10, Rhode Island had a lot of similarities to Vermont. They had a school construction moratorium that the state put into place in 2011. They did have some differences. They were pretty generous prior to 2011 with their general fund to support school construction and financing at the local level through the state prior to 2011. They hadn't bonded for school construction since 1994, so they really were sort of acting as a pay-go for that period of time. But their schools were getting to a place where both from a life and safety standpoint and also from a programmatic standpoint, things were getting pretty rough throughout the state. So they issued a report in 2017, an audit of all of their schools, kind of similar to what the Agency of Education is doing now. The Schoolhouses report detailing 50,000 deficiencies across their 300 or so schools. So these deficiencies related to things like hazardous materials in buildings, fire suppression issues that weren't up to code, and then programmatic things like not having sufficient science labs or infrastructure to support things like that. So as a result, the state of Rhode Island put together a task force led by their treasurer and their secretary of education that came up with a financing mechanism over the long term to try to chip away at this $2.2 billion price tag. They put together an incentive plan so that state monies could be used for local school construction, but it was prioritized by things like, if you had the ability to consolidate two schools into one within a district, if you had the ability to bring an overcrowded district, down so that there was a sort of norm. So if you had, too many students for how big the building was, those would be prioritized if you were able to bring that down per square foot. Environmental improvements, life and safety was number one. But there are other handful of incentives to determine, whose project got the first priority in terms of the state money. And then there was also a stronger requirement for schools to provide adequate maintenance and upkeep throughout the life of the building so that did not deteriorate over the periods of time. So as I mentioned, $2.2 billion in funding was necessary, and they actually have, combined with the state and the locals, had a pretty significant amount of funding that has come through over the last 4.5 years. The state of Rhode Island is committed to $500 million in bonding. $250 million has already been issued. Another $250 million is about to be issued by the state of Rhode Island. And that's leveraging another $1.7 billion at the local level. So the Rhode Island strategy has found that, they had incentivized a lot of local municipalities to go forward with projects that had not been, having groundbreaking and not moved forward. They found that they created quite a bit of upfront economic activity from all the construction, and then a lot of long-term economic activity from having high quality schools throughout the entire state. I think we already touched on those two other points. So they really tackled this in a systematic way with all of the appropriate stakeholders together to think both about the needs, health and safety, programmatic financing needs, and then some of the long-term strategic needs of the facilities in their school, what school districts needed more space, what school districts could go with less space, what other unique qualities existed across their state. So an interesting model for Vermont to consider as we are tackling the issue of school construction financing.
Did Rhode Island come up with a alternate source besides bonding in the future, or?
So they have, they continued to spend their general fund money. You could get, I think the minimum was 30% of your school construction would come from the state's general fund. But then for some districts that were less affluent, that amount could go up to into the 90% that the state was covering. So the bond sort of supercharged those activities and allowed some upfront spending for school districts. So it was a combination of bonding and their general fund is how they financed it.
And I think a detail worth naming about a difference between the two places is that they don't have a statewide education fund in Rhode Island. So local spending is truly local spending that they were contributing to that, whereas in Vermont, it's a blend. Other?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I gather from this, we almost exclusively use general obligation bonds as opposed to a mix of revenue bonds. And I wonder, have we experimented or inquired about mixing an increase in the share of revenue bonds and whether that would jeopardize our rating, if you will, and consequently the interest expenditures?
Well, I think, Representative, is something that would be worthy of further exploration as we think about.
If I'm reading this correctly, we only use revenue bonds in the transportation sector.
Yeah, and those have been recently paid off.
Yeah, that's what I gathered. But again, we had them at one time. I don't know whether that's a way to sort of diversify long-term funding.
I think it's certainly a topic for discussion.
Representative Beck?
In the Rhode Island case study where a strong majority of voters voted for the plan, 2.2 billion, what was the revenue source?
So general fund and then bonding capacity for the state. So they didn't identify a specific, there wasn't a specific revenue increase as far as I know, or a specific new type of revenue. They did it within their existing capacity.
Within their existing.
Except for the bonding, that was new money. The 250 million.
They paid the bond with existing general fund money.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
As far as I know, I'll check to make sure that's what I understand though.
Yeah.
Mr. Treasurer, was the 2.2 billion the total that they spent in Rhode Island on school construction, or that was just bonding, right?
I think that.
Are there other revenues as well that went in?
So the 2.2 was both the assessment of what was necessary, but then I think that's also the total that they've spent in the last 5 years. And that, of the state's portion, at this point, that would be 250 million that the state has bonded for. They're going to bond for another 250 million. So the rest of that, 2.2 billion came from the general fund or the local municipality bonding.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I really appreciate the strategic approach that Rhode Island took to really fully understand the need, to talk strategically about prioritizing the need with all the right stakeholders at the table, because I feel like we're sort of partway there with the stakeholders at the table with ANR and AOE talking to each other, but I still feel like the big picture is missing somewhat from that. So I appreciate you bringing that in this talk.
And they also, we spoke with Rhode Island. I mean, they also prioritize professionalizing the process of construction. So not having that burden fall on a principal or a superintendent, but requirement, I think, is if a project was over $1.5 million, that there was a professional manager of that project that may even been prior approved vendors, but that sat within these individuals that had expertise and not within the school district. So they focus a lot on easing, getting the most bang for their buck, and then trying to make the process as efficient for the school district as possible.
Thank you. Rep. Maslin, Rep. Bodie.
On professionalizing the process, where did it start? making the plans up, drawing the plans, I mean, way back as far as that, all the way through construction completion.
When did they bring in the?
When did the professionals?
Yeah, so they said their threshold was if the project was over 1.5 million,
Okay.
and they were required to have this sort of, I guess maybe more official than a clerk of the works, but sort of an individual that would manage that process.
Let me ask the question a little differently.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. Did the professionals also get involved with the architect on what's going to be built?
Right, yeah.
Sort of stuff?
I think yes, but they also, I don't know, I believe they've put this into the legislation. The recommendation had some parameters around what could be built. So if you were to build a gymnasium, they had, a few certain types of gymnasiums that could be built, so that they tried to limit, cost overruns.
There's a couple of ways to do that. Just curious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So they tried to, you could view it as limiting, but I think they tried to make them more uniform, so you didn't have a school
Sure.
that was.
I'm going to joke about the camel.
Yeah.
Done by a committee.
Right.
So,
I just want to say, I love this holistic look too. And deficiencies related to health, safety, and programmatic, I wanted to add that environmental issues concern. To do an enormous amount of work along a river than maybe for water. And then considering that with the location of the school.
And Rhode Island did incorporate an environmental peg too, they looked at whether they'd, be solar panels in the project or other energy efficiencies, potentially the environment around the school as well. But yeah, those kind of things were incorporated as one of their incentives, which was, I think, wise.
Repairing barriers and those kinds of things.
Wait until we have the construction experts to help every community understand how they might think about repairing barriers in their.
Repairing barriers.
I can't even say that, school construction projects. I think I just want to echo what I've heard other people say, really appreciate this opportunity to sort of like step back and say, many of our communities are facing the same challenges. And, we can either have that conversation one community at a time, or we can say, hey, how in this moment do we think kind of big picture about what the whole need is, think strategically about how to prioritize where we put those resources forward. And for me, there's such an important equity piece here too, right? Like, how do we help all communities who may not have their own bond rating, like access lower cost capital to help save us all money in the long run? And so really appreciate you sort of bringing this Rhode Island model forward. And, as we line up all the different assessments and all the needs, the needs going to be big, but this kind of global conversation, I really appreciate it. And also how do we make sure every community can be as efficient and effective with using those resources to not like relearn the same lessons each time we rebuild the school.
Yeah, absolutely. The money will go further.
And I imagine, as Secretary of Education said, it sounds like they have limited capacity right now to be aligning all of these different issues. And it sounds like this task force, maybe that could be one of their first activities, would be to align all of those reports to understand the need comprehensively.
Yeah, and I think the incentive piece is really important for, once you have the right stakeholders, and then of course, how you're going to pay for it. And so, all of those are important, but I think you want to have a broad perspective on each one.
I realize that we did not start this whole conversation with how is school construction paid for right now, because it is. And so when you're finished, we're going to have Julia Richter just come up for 5 minutes and make sure we understand that. So anything else you would like to share that?
No, just we would be certainly open and willing and eager to work on these issues from the treasurer's office standpoint.
Thank you. And look forward to seeing you soon about a different issue.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So full disclosure, I asked Julia to do this at the very, very last minute, like 10 minutes ago. So there is no presentation. She's just going to come up and say some things to us. So please be gentle.
No, we should do that.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. For the record, Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. So as Chair Kornheiser mentioned, I don't have any slides or materials prepared, but can just talk sort of big picture, what we're thinking about when we think of school construction and the education fund at the moment. So as we remember, there's those different ways that homestead property taxes are calculated, right? And that local adjustment portion is the education spending per equalized pupil. And so in 2007, there was the moratorium of having as Treasurer Pichek mentioned, having school construction paid for as sort of a line item out of the education fund. But that doesn't mean that just school construction ceased to exist. So the way that it is currently funded out of the education fund is it's included in the education spending of a school district. So school districts are building their budgets, and those school construction needs and the debt service is falling into their local school budget. So it's still being paid for out of the education fund, but it's not being paid for in the way that we may be thinking about it in terms of just a line that's saying school construction. So communities that increase school construction costs, all else equal, would see an increase in their locally adjusted tax rate as well. The one other piece I will add with respect to the remarks I think might be helpful for this conversation is that with respect to that excess spending threshold, most debt service and construction costs are excluded when calculating that excess spending. And you'll recall that the excess spending threshold is suspended through 2029, FY 2029.
One thing that's very stark to me about this issue is that some communities, for whatever financial, political, social reality, are able to pass a bond in their district. And then those costs are carried by the voters in that district, but also by all the rest of us through the ed fund. And some districts are not. And so I think we're seeing pretty profound inequities in school construction from community to community.
I would echo that, Madam Chair. My community has historically been a pinch penny. We're like the second lowest per pupil in the whole state. It's just so difficult to raise money, no matter the prosperity or whatever. But where I want to go with what I just heard, then it would also follow that there is no standard, predictable, equitable target proportion between state funds and local funds when school construction is treated as a garden variety educational expense and rolled into the formula. Am I correct about that?
So my understanding of your question, and I think that this is taking a step back, I'm sure the committee is aware, but for folks watching at home, it's helpful to keep in mind that all dollars raised by local property taxes are state dollars that then get filtered out to the community. And so to get to your point, Representative, I think that that's true, that because these school districts are building their own respective budgets, that it's a local decision and it impacts local property tax rates, but that doesn't mean that that local school district is going to be paying for all of those school construction costs. They'll see their tax rates reflect those choices, but depending on how everything is moving within the education fund, property taxpayers around the state to different degrees will also be picking up some of those costs.
It just seems to me, because this is not an inexhaustible bucket, as it were, that order will count. That is to say, who can get the bond passed earlier rather than later, before there might be some squeeze, if you will, on the ability to match what's voted.
I think that the sort of the one step further there is helpful to remember that the property tax ultimately acts as that final adjustable to fill up that remaining bit. So if lots of school districts vote budgets and education spending goes way up, I mean, we're seeing this year right now estimated education spending to increase by 8.5%. those yields and property tax rates are going to be set in such a manner to make sure that all of those districts are funded. Or the General Assembly could decide to do something else, but traditionally that's what's done.
Julia, do you have any sense of what percentage of that per pupil spending per statewide is going to pay construction bonds?
That's a great question. I do not know, but I can certainly look into it.
Is there some way to break that out? I mean, that would be a
I think
super helpful thing for us to know.
I could look into the feasibility of breaking that out, and it might get down to looking at each individual school budget.
Right.
And combing through those.
Seeing what's debt service in each budget.
Because we still don't have the e-finance system.
Brad James might have.
Yeah.
Pull it out pretty quickly.
Okay. Thanks for looking into that, Julia, and we will not.
I will certainly do my homework. I'll give Brad another call. He hears from me all the time. So.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for that. And we're going to wrap up for the day. We'll see everyone tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to talk about consumption taxes.
Cool.
I know, so exciting.